Okay, now what you're looking at is several weeks worth of work for a student. Something like this in the industry could be done probably within a day. The animation, the modeling, the rigging, and then the starting of the rendering out. When we hit that render button, it really is up to the computer to do all the calculating and whatever else. The information we've provided to it will dictate how long that process takes. So for this animation, these are all the files that come out of it. So for every single frame, it's going to go through and it's going to calculate. You have a light here. The light's hitting the object. The object is reflective, so it's going to pick up some of the reflections in the area. There's a shadow on the ground, so it's going to show a shadow. The ground might also be reflective, so it's picking that up. There's a glowing object here, so it's going to glow and it's going to light up different things. Every single frame, it does that. So for this animation, which is 180 frames long, I started it at 11:45 p.m. at night, usually when p.m. is. And then this ended at 3:14, an hour or 45 minutes later. So this rendering didn't take very long. This is actually a pretty simple rendering, okay? There's not a whole lot of stuff happening to it. Here's another one, which is a water wheel. Let's see how long this one took. 1:33. And this is, oops. There we go, 120 frames. So this one started at 1:30 in the afternoon and it finished around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, okay? Now, just to see the complexity of the water wheel one versus the other one, let's just drop this in here. Yes, stop thinking and then drop that in. Come on. Or just be picky about it and I'll do it. B drive, samples. Oh, there they go. They all came at the same time. So this one doesn't look a whole lot more complex. It's basically just some wooden parts and they're rolling around. What makes this one more complex is the kind of materials that I've used. On the water wheel itself, you can see the textures of the kind of like this wood texture, but there's also like these streaky things on there. There's some metal here that has some kind of rusty texture to it. Each one of those is a large file being projected or placed on that item to make it look that way. Also, I think they're about the same size, right? Yeah, they're both the same size. Now, if I look at frame number 1, that started at 1:33 or finished at 1:33, and the next frame finished at 1:35, and the next one finished at 1:37. So you can see how it's about 2 minutes per frame, right? Whereas the Chickster in 11:45 was right here, and then I was able to do 4 frames at 11:46. Okay, so obviously a lot quicker. So when we get into cinema and we're doing this stuff, everything we do will make it take longer or take shorter time. So our goal is to optimize this. These assignments here, these first ones, are going to be pretty simple. They should render out probably within a few hours. There shouldn't be anything that will take days and days and days to do, okay? I have had some that have taken days and days and days to do. This one and this one. That render. So this one here, here's frame 88, which is at 1:31, and this is frame 90, which is at 1:46. So you see it takes about 15 minutes per frame to render out. So if I'm doing 100 frames, that's 1,500 hours or 1,500 minutes of render time, okay? If something is screwed up, I forgot a light or I forgot something or didn't turn out good, I restart it and do it over again, or I restart it and do it over again, okay? So when we get into cinema, this is what we want to kind of focus on, is eventually we're going to get to that point of having that. I mentioned before looking at things on Pinterest. Google. Why have you forgotten me, Pinterest? Yes. Don't look at my password. Yes, I'm ready to discover my new ideas. Motion graphics. I discussed before looking at different motion graphics titles. Cinema 4D. There you go, stuff like this. Now, when we look at something like this, what we're looking for is if we like this style and we're trying to emulate something like that. I'm not saying that we need to copy it. I'm just saying emulate it as far as coloring, as far as the lighting and all that. What we do is we kind of break it down into the different pieces and see what makes it work the way it does. And you can see the same thing kind of here too. Same thing kind of here, where we see this like vignette in the background, and then we see the piece of text or something right there. Same thing here. You see the, oops. Come on. Just don't want to see that. All right, we see the vignette, and then we see the letter here. And that's hard to see because of Vimeo's thing there. Maybe if I make this bigger. But you can see there's a shadow on the ground as well. Okay. So a lot of the stuff that we can do, we can set all of that stuff up initially. And then as we work on our stuff, we can just kind of use it as our base for all of our projects. Okay. So on our text here, before I even get into doing a piece of text or doing like the animation for it, I'm just going to set up the scene, which then I will use to as my environment for what I render all my stuff in. So I'm going to look at really any one of these. Something like this, where we see this background vignetted. Yeah, it works. Actually, this one's better. Okay. And I want my stuff to look like it's just sitting there. If you look at photographing products, so this is a real world image of what it would look like. So you would have this item, you would have this backdrop, this seamless backdrop that just rolls like this, and you would have these lights around it, and that's what would give this item its appeal, what would give it the lighting for the scene. So in Cinema, we can definitely do that. I can create a seamless backdrop like that. I can put lights on the side and all this stuff, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make a random object. So I always make something like a sphere or a cube or something that I can just use as my placeholder. Okay, and we talked about this before. Any object I make, I put it on the floor. I don't like to have anything sitting in the ground. Okay, now a couple buttons we'll use. Control R is rendering right inside the view. So right inside this window, it'll render it right here. Shift R will bring up a brand new window and render this right here. Okay, so typically I'll use Shift R because this will keep a history on the side. I could then go through and see which ones I want to focus on, okay, or what changes I've made. I'm going to throw that off to the side for now. So I'm going to put in a ground. Under here is a floor. So I click that, and then again I'll hit Shift R so you can see it, but now I have a floor in my scene. If I turn my camera and I hit Shift R again, oops, let me pick a better angle. There we go. You can see kind of the floor right there. Enable filter, contrast. There you go. Now you can see the floor. Okay, so that gives me a floor. Now I'm going to put in a background. So I'm going to go to the same spot and put in a background. And now when I render, here's the background, here's the floor. Okay, now I need this to look seamless. I need one background area and the floor to blend together nicely. So this is where we get a little bit fancy. So I'm going to come down here. I've mentioned before this is where we bring in materials. I need to create a material that I can use for that. And the material is basically going to be this background. So I'm going to think of Photoshop. If you're drawing an image and you want the background to be like that, you would give it a solid color and you would give it some kind of gradation on the outside. That's what I'm going to do for that background. So I'm going to double click down here. That creates a material. Materials give items a definition of what they should look like, okay? So an apple has a certain color, it has a certain reflectivity, it has a certain bumpiness to it. An orange has different values. A light bulb has different values, okay? Down here, that's where we're telling it what those values are. So now I'm going to double click this. On the right side, you can't see it really because my screen is covering it, but on the right side is all of these options that I'm going to still see when I double click. It just makes it easier for you to see it, and typically I work like that, so it's easier for me to see it. Okay, so this is the same as that. So I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call this background. And then I'm going to go to a color. Okay, so for right now, I'm just going to leave it as orange. I will adjust the color afterwards. Notice the different tabs that are here. So color, diffusion, luminance, transparency, and so on. If at any point you don't know what one of these mean, you can simply look up the word diffusion and figure out what that word would mean. The spreading of something more widely. Boom. Means nothing for us right here now, but that's what it means. There's also reflectance, which I'm assuming would be reflecting, right? Environment, and so on. For the background, I just want color. That's all I'm after. So I just uncheck the box here, and then I don't get it. If I'm down in this area and I'm trying to turn things on and off, I go to the Basic tab, and that's where the check boxes are. So just be aware that that's where those live. Now, these, even though I've created this definition for what the background is, and I've called it background, when I render, they're still rendering the same color. So I have to actually just drop this onto background, and then drop this onto floor. And now when I render, you'll see that both of those things get that same image. Okay? Now, in Cinema, it's right now treating both of those things as pieces of geometry. If I made a sphere and I put it on a ground and I had a light hitting it, the light would have shadows and all this other stuff. Depending on the angle the light's hitting it, it would shade it differently too. That's why this gray sphere has a highlight in the middle and this shadow along the edge. So it's doing the same thing. Even though they're the same color, it's still choosing or showing us different values for it. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to Cinema Tags, and I'm going to go to Compositing. And what this will let me do is I'm going to turn off Cast Shadows, because I don't want to cast shadows. And I'm going to say I want to use this as a background. Then I'm going to hold down Control and copy this to the floor. So now when I hit Shift-R, I should see one solid color. Okay, that's what I want. Even though I have a floor and a background, I only have, it only exists right there as one solid piece. Now I'm going to double click this again, and I'm going to change what I want this color to be. I want it to be a gradient, so I want it darker around the edges and lighter in the center. So right here, we're picking just a single color. That's all that is. Okay. Down here under texture, you have an arrow. You can pick from the list what you want. So gradient, same definition that we would see in other areas, gradient. And you'll see how it's placed right now. We'll adjust that. Now it created it. I need to edit it, so I'm going to click this. This works the same way as all your other ones. So you can just double click, pick your color. So in this case, let's say that I'm trying to go with this kind of theme. So I'm going to pick this like pinkish beige color. Actually somewhere over here. And then on this side, I'm going to go with, you know, maybe something a bit darker. I'm going to go something there. I like that color better anyway. Cool. This is the kind. So think of Photoshop or Illustrator. When you make a gradient, you typically have like a linear gradient, which is just like side to side, or what's the other one? The rounded one? Radial gradient, circular gradient, right? So same thing, but in 3D we have all these different ones. Okay? So circular is the one we want. This will give us lightness in the middle and darkness on the edges. If we've screwed up, we can swap these. I would just move this to this side, and move that to that side, and then we can change the colors around that way, or we can do whatever we need to. Okay, so I'll adjust this a little bit further like this, maybe like that. Maybe I'll make this a little bit desaturated more, and make this a little bit lighter. All right, we'll just start with there. There's also a dot in the middle, so you can control where the kind of focus is. I'm going to leave it there for now, okay? Anything I did to this will trickle down to these things, okay? So I do it one spot and it changes it there. I render and this is what I get. Not what I wanted, okay? Because we're dealing in 3D, it doesn't know how to place that material. So think of this gradient as just a flat image. It doesn't know how to place that flat image on the ground and on the background and all these other spots. So if I click on the floor, click on the material right here, this projection area is where I control that. So I'm going to say frontal. I'm going to go to background, even though it looked fine, and just make sure that the projection for background is also frontal. And now when I render it, we get that. Okay? So this setup is something you'll use over and over and over again for a lot of motion graphics projects. Like I mentioned before, if you go to motion graphics, especially up in Cinema 4D motion graphics, and you go to images, you'll see this setup all over the place. All of these. Okay? Every single one of these that you're seeing like this is using a setup very similar to what we're doing. It looks great. It's nice and clean. It's easy to change the colors and give it a new look altogether. That's what we want. Now, it looks like so far that we have a ball and we have just a gradient in the background. It doesn't look like the ball is actually sitting on the ground. Okay? What's missing from this picture? Lighting, someone said, right? So we don't have a light in the scene, and we don't have a light, we don't have shadows. So this is the light bulb, so you can imagine that that's where all the light stuff is going to be. We're going to use, for this project, an area light. Okay? We'll get into more detail about each one of these, what they do, why we would choose one over another. But for this project, we're just going to use area light. And think of this like you're doing an actual like studio project. You're doing an actual photographing session. Where the lights are is going to depend on how they're lighting up our object. So if we put it right there, the light is basically like inside of our subject. We can't see anything. I don't know why a light is inside the subject, but it is. We put it here, and now we have this. Now also see that it's facing directly straight. So I would want to go to R to rotate it. And then I can rotate this down. And then I can go back to the move tool and kind of rotate this over to the side. All right. So now this light is basically facing, it's really far off. It's facing our sphere. So now when we render this, now we can see that it does have some lighting on the side of that. I'm going to turn my filter off just so we can see it in real state, yes. All right, so we still don't have the shadow. Nothing in 3D is typically turned on by default. So you can have a light that doesn't have a shadow. You can have a shadow which doesn't give light off, okay? One of the cool things about it, because in photography a lot of times you have lights that you want to light up your subject, but you may not want the shadow from those lights, okay? So on the light, I click it, and here is a million different options for different things that we may want to do. For our shadow, we go to the Shadow tab, and from the shadow area, we just tell it what kind of light that we have, or what kind of shadows we want. We want area light, or area shadows, because we have an area light. Now we render, and now we have that sphere sitting on the ground, okay? Now I mentioned nothing is given to us in 3D for free. So we see this light, it's hitting the sphere, it's giving us a shadow. What doesn't look right about it? Think if you were to draw this and you drew this type of object here, the light comes, it hits the sphere, we have our shadow line. What should be on the other side of this? Right, should we get some bounce light, right? The ground should kind of bounce up and give us some illumination on the other side of the sphere. So this is, there's no bounce light. We could turn it on, we can go to our render settings and play with stuff. That takes longer to render. So I'm just going to add another light. And I'm just going to position it like this, like that. And then I'm going to go to, I'll render it out first so you can see it. So there's what that light looks like. I'm going to go into the second light's general and just take down the intensity of it. There we go. So now we still have that line there. It still looks like the main light's coming from that top side, but now we have this lighter area. If this shadow is too dark, I can go back to this light, I can go back to these shadows, and I can take the density of that down. Okay, so again, everything that we want to tweak and play with and modify, we can do at any point. So things like even the shadow color, I may not like this shadow color, and I want to adjust it to, give it a little bit of this purpley tone. Maybe a little bit more. There we go. So now it has a little bit of purple in the shadow, which then helps kind of seal it into the rest of the scene. Okay? So now this setup is done. I can save this. I'm going to drop this in here and just call it Sarcona background setup. And any other scene I ever need for this, all I have to do is open up that scene, jump to this background color, maybe change some of the coloring on this gradient. So let's say I want to do a blue one. I'll just switch this to blue. I'll go to this one, switch that to blue, render it, and now I have a completely different setup. Okay? So that's the first part of doing any of your text assignment, is getting this background set up, because it just makes everything feel a little bit more realistic when you're working on your stuff. Now I mentioned I like to use this picture viewer so I can see previous iterations. If I go to my history, here's all the stuff that I rendered out. So here's the very start of this, and I can cycle through and see the different versions of this and how it got to be at the very end of that. Now, at this point, you may not know why you'd want that, but just trust me, that's something you would want to have. If I change a value like the shadow color, I may want to see it before and after to see if I actually did do a change on it. Okay? All right, so now that this is done, I'm going to take all this stuff. I can get rid of the sphere. I'm done with that. And I'm just going to group all of this stuff using Alt-G, type in background setup. And I'm going to start with my text. Okay, so this is the part that we did last time. So I'm going to go to my MoText. I'm going to type in my word. Actually, I'm going to use Meka. I'll do that one this time. And this is another good reason to have your ground in, because then I can see, oh, the C is sticking through. I need to then scoot that up. So I'm going to grab my 3D GUI, switch to my front view. And it looks like the A and the M are also floating, so that has to change also. So I'll have to adjust that. So the C, I'm going to click and drag and move up, or at least try to move it up. Come on. Nope, you can do it. Just move up. Now, scoot up. What are you doing? There it goes. It's grabbing the wrong thing. There. So I'm going to grab this and shift it right to that line. Okay. Then I'm going to jump out of my 3D GUI. All right, it looks like we're not floating. I guess we weren't floating. Okay, so everything's good there. So now it says Meka. I do want to adjust some of the kerning on this too, so let's adjust that. So just sliding that over some, sliding that over. Remember, we're looking for the spacing between the letters here. That should be very similar between all of these. There we go. Cool. I'm going to give this a little bit of fillet caps. Once I added that, I may have pushed my letters underneath again, so I'm going to hit constrain, and that will make sure that they constrain to the original shape, the original size that they were. Then I can add some more steps in here, add some more steps in here. All right, so that looks good. So now I'm ready to just go ahead and animate this stuff coming in. So now this part is the same that we did before. I'm going to go to my MoGraph, go to Effector, go to Plane, and I'm just going to control how I want these things to come in. So I'm going to have these start at about, I guess 700 is fine. Start at 700. I'm also going to have them scale uniformly from -1. -1. Come on. There we go. And I'll also add some rotation here of like, I don't know, let's try 90 here. Okay. So I created my text. I adjusted the position. I made this plane effector. And now to animate it, I need to add that fall off. So there's the fall off. Okay. I don't like how it's rotating there. So I'm going to go back to my plane effector, go back to parameter. So that -90 and -45. There we go. That might be kind of cool there. Okay. Now, some other stuff, we didn't talk about this. The size of this will dictate the smoothness of it. So if this is huge, you can see how gradual each letter is kind of like sliding in, and as the M is sliding in, the A is right behind it, and the C is right behind that, and the A is right behind that. If this is small, like this, then the A goes away, then the C goes away, then the A goes away, and then the M goes away. Okay? So it all depends on the kind of animation you want as to what you're going to get there. I'm going to go kind of in the middle here. I'm going to have a little bit of overlap. Like that's good. So as the M is just settling, I see the A coming in. As the A is settling, I see the C coming in, and so on. Okay? So now I'm going to set my keyframes. I go to frame 0. I go to my linear field, go to coordinates, set up the X. Go to frame 90, slide this across, set my other key. So now I hit play, and then I should see my animation. Now I want this to happen maybe a little bit quicker, so I'm just going to grab the keyframe. One of the cool things in Cinema is you can just click on the keyframe down here and slide it. So I'm going to slide this to about 60 frames, which makes it go a little bit faster. And then I'm going to click on the MoText. I'm going to add one more thing to this, which is delay. I'm going to change this to spring. There we go. And then we'll get that little bounce as it pops in. Let me pull it down a little bit. It might be a little bit too much. There we go. Cool. All right, so I like that. So now I'm just going to make a new material. I'll drag this onto my text, and I'll give this a name. So this is my text. So my background, I'm going to hit Shift-R again, is this bluish color. So I don't want to go with blue on this. I could. Let's just see what that looks like. Okay, if I go dark enough, it works. But if I go with something maybe a little bit too similar to that background, it might just be kind of lost in it. I don't want that. So maybe I'll go with something orange, have more of a complementary color there. There we go. I also don't like how deep that shadow is. It seems really long shadows. That seems odd. I don't want that. Just adjust that light. And for every project, you're going to have to adjust lighting. You're going to have to adjust, a lot of these things here. And if I make this bigger, it'll actually soften the shadows out as well. So I want this to hit from the front, but I'm going more above it, so the shadows basically shoot straight down. There we go. So that looks a lot nicer. They're still longer, but they're softer shadows, and they're more on the bottom of it. All right, so let me jump back to my material, and then I'm going to adjust the reflection of this. Just like lighting, there's a million different lights. On reflection, there's a million different ways that we could reflect something. And the more realistic we go, the different the look of it. So something like this, you can see these highlights up here. This is all reflection happening there. Whereas something like this, there's no reflection. This is all just like straight color, okay? Right here. This too also has refraction on it, so we're seeing like through the glass. So I'm going to go to reflectance. I'm going to change this to Beckman, which is a different way to calculate reflections. I'll render it so we can see what it looks like. Okay. Now you'll notice that there is a similarity between what we see here and what we see there, but it's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you'll change the color here to red or yellow or whatever, and you won't see it. Until you hit render, then you should see it. Okay. If you hit render and it doesn't show up here, something's wrong. All right, so I want to adjust what that looks like. It actually doesn't look too bad. But just to show you the differences, typically you're going to play with these three manipulators: roughness, reflection strength, and specular strength. This is a preview of just what the reflection looks like. This is a preview of your material and reflection and anything else you may have on it. So as I pull the roughness down, you can see that we don't have anything. There's like nothing showing up there. As I pull the roughness up, you can see it's very spread out, okay? Now I'm going to pull this back down. I'm going to pull reflection strength back up, and now you can see this is basically like a chrome ball is what this is, and this is like a tinted chrome ball because we have the color and the reflection mixing together to give us that look. If we wanted a full chrome ball, we would just get rid of the color. There's no color, full chrome. Okay. Now, if I were to just render this out, this is what it's going to look like. Now, we're getting this weird distortion here because what it's reflecting is the ground, but there is no ground really on the other side of the camera, like behind us. It only exists like where we're seeing it. So in this case, this reflection as this kind of chromey material doesn't really work. This roughness just takes that and just blurs it. So you can have something that is very reflective, but just very rough, so it blurs out and you get this kind of look. So a lot of times you're going to be just kind of playing with these settings to get the look you're after, trying to control how much of the original color you want, how much of the reflection you want, and so on. So like this, it looks too washed out. So I'm going to pull the reflection strength down, pull the roughness down. Now the other one you may want to tweak is a specular strength. Specular, reflection, those are all very similar things. If I pull this off and I pull reflection off, you'll see that there still is nothing there. When we have specular, that's what those highlights are, okay? So that looks pretty decent the way that is. As I'm rendering this, I'm checking, does it look like it's on the ground? Yes. Nothing looks weird. It doesn't look like there's any weird spacing. The shadows look good. All right, so that's good. Okay, so now, boop, 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 boop. There we go. So now I finished one. That's one of our pieces, okay? We're going to do 3 of these of different kinds, okay? So that's one. I'll show you one that I did last night. Fall, that's us, 2510, this. And open with, search. So in this one, you see these little white dust particles there. I created these particles, and then I had them kind of floating, and then I had the text kind of popping up out of the ground. Okay, your scene should have nothing on the screen, and then the text shows up, or you have the text on the screen, and then it goes away somehow. Okay? But look at the setup. It's the same thing. You see we have this gradient here in the background. We have the text there. We have nice lighting, nice shadows. Okay. On our canvas, back to canvas. Yes. Portions 20 by 10. I'll put this video up there, but I also have creating text, animating text with MoGraph. I'll also do this title explosion. That was from last time. You don't need that one. And so on. Okay? So these are several different examples of different text, different ways to animate things apart from just doing this way. Okay? Obviously, I want you to have time to play with this, to get used to these things. 2 of these you can do along with my example. So the one I just did, you can follow that. That's one of yours. Another one I show in the video, you can follow that and do another one of those. A third one, you're going to find a tutorial or just figure something out as far as how you want to animate it. All of them should be different. So if I animate one with the position of it kind of coming down, my next one is going to be the position coming up because that's the same thing. I would do some other way. So maybe I have one of these explode. Maybe I have one of these reassemble itself. Here are some examples of different ones. 2510. Titles. There's final. All right. So there's one coming together. There's the water wheel. I don't know why I have those in there. It's weird. But you can see like this one is one that I go over in the video, how to bring this stuff together. We'll also notice some other stuff that's on here. One of the things is motion blur. As these pieces are moving into the screen and moving into position, it looks weird if everything is crystal clear. We typically expect to see motion blur, which is what we're seeing there. We also have some other stuff going on. We'll go over the render settings part of this afterwards. Here we go. Open with, choose. Always use that. There's another one. Notice the background didn't show up in this one just because of the viewer that I'm playing it through. Okay. All right. I think it's probably just the default falling one. Oh, this is the other one. Yeah, so this one I animated a bunch of these just falling down. Silly. Here's an assembling one. Okay, now notice each one of these is 90 frames long, and I'm allowing time to process it at the end. None of these are finishing right at 90. We never want to finish it right at the end because then we don't have time for anyone to process what's happening. If this was the last frame right there and it's over, then we kind of like missed the idea of it. But these are all the same process. The only thing different on something like this is how I've broken up these letters initially before I did all of the MoGraph stuff. Oops. And this one I used some other tools outside of where you would take this first one. And that's what the finished one looks like there. Okay. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to let you guys work on this for the rest of the class. I do want to go over one more thing so you know how we're turning stuff in. So when you turn stuff in for this class, every assignment you're going to turn in your files that you have for Cinema. So it's typically going to be your movie that you've rendered out. You're going to turn in your Cinema file, and then you'll also turn in this sheet. And this sheet lets you know what I want for these assignments, something you can kind of look at and say, okay, what size are we rendering these out? What is the turn-ins for it? What does he expect for this? And so on. What's the due date? How many points is it worth? I have a purple binder up at the front. I typically will have this printed and have this in here too. So the first couple assignments we'll go through this together. After that, I'll go through it and just have it here. You come up after and just copy it down if you need to, or watch it in the lecture. So this assignment is 3D titles. The due date is going to be September 11th, 2019. I put the comma in the wrong spot. Fix that. And the idea with this, or the purpose of it, is to explore different ways to animate text using MoGraph and effectors. Okay? So it's the same thing, it's just that same process over and over. And obviously we're also looking at how do we animate stuff, period. How do we light things, how do we render things out, put them together. So as I mentioned, you'll do 3 titles, 2 of them using the instructions I provide. And then one of them will be a your choice one where you find a tutorial of someone else's, or you just assemble one based off of, you know, the things that you've seen. There's never a time where you'll find a technique that you won't use later on. Typically you just kind of build on your techniques, and when you get to a project you're just putting them all together. You'll use a seamless backdrop. We'll be using motion blur and ambient occlusion. If you watch the definitions video, you know what ambient occlusion is and motion blur. If not, I will go over what those are and how to set them up afterwards. We want nice lighting and nice shadows. I'll go over layers and organizing all of our stuff. Your turn-ins for this, any research or concept development. So I mentioned before, going onto YouTube, going onto Pinterest, going onto Google Images, and finding different color schemes you like, finding different titles that you like, different layouts that you like, any animations that you've kind of looked at. As you're looking at different tutorials, as you're looking at different ways people have done stuff, start cataloging all of this because that will be part of your turn-in, okay? You'll turn in your project folder, which will be your latest scene file and movie. As I showed my renderings, I showed all these files, one for each frame. I don't need those. You will not turn in all your individual frames. That's way too much data for me to even try to transfer. All I want is the latest cinema file and your movie, and that's all I'll need for the grading part. For your movies, you're going to take all 3 titles, put them together, and that'll be roughly 9 seconds of animation. Okay? So that means that each one of your titles should be 3 seconds long. Each one of your titles should be 90 frames long. Okay? We have a resolution there. That will come into play later. Don't worry about that now. And then MACA 2510, Intro to 3D. And we have 12 possible points on this one. Now, when you do this, you do your assignment, we're ready to turn stuff in, you're going to make a folder, drop your movie into the final folder, drop your scene file into the scenes folder. If you have a collection of images that you have on file, you can drop them into a resources or reference image area. You'll put that onto my server and you'll submit your form right there. So my last class, here's all their forms for their assignment. This one isn't due until September 11th, so we don't have to worry about this until we get to September 11th. If you give me your sheet, I go through your assignment and I say, okay, here's what I requested, here's what you turned in. I'll make notes. You're missing this, this, and this. Here's how many points you got. I'll put that into Canvas. When we come to class next, I give you your sheet back. If you're satisfied with your grade, you can do whatever you want with your sheet. Hopefully you recycle it. Otherwise, if you fix it, you'll fix it up, resubmit all your stuff the same way, check this little box that says resubmit, and then you give it back to me. That way I have all your stuff in my files, I have your piece of paper, and we're ready to go.